Agreed and so ordered. The House will now proceed to the consideration of private members' business as listed on today's order paper. Orders of the day.
Members' business. Consideration at second reading of Bill C-211, Federal Framework on Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder Act, in the name of Mr. Doherty.
Mr. Doherty, seconded by Mr. Brassard, moves that Bill C-211, an act respecting a federal framework on post-traumatic stress disorder, be now read a second time and referred to the Standing Committee on Health. Debate. The Honourable Member for Caribou, Prince George.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to speak to Bill C-211. But before I get into my speech, I want to first acknowledge and thank the first responders, the veterans, active military, who emailed, called, and whom I have met with in person. Mr. Speaker, many of them are on the Hill with us today. I want to acknowledge their courage in coming forward, their fight to break the stigma, and their fight to break the silence. These are brave men and women who have been ridiculed, shamed, told to suck it up and move on, that they're making it up, that they're faking it. Even worse yet, they have been told they are weak. I want to thank them for trusting me enough to share their stories with me. And Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the families and friends of those who could not fight any longer, for their strength, for their commitment to ensure their loved ones are remembered and that their fight was not in vain. Moreover, I want to apologize to all that this has taken so long to get to this point. Mr. Speaker, I've had this speech prepared for a while now, and as I wrote it, I took time to reflect on the hundreds of individuals whom I've had the privilege of meeting with over the last year, those who have helped get this bill off the ground, and the thousands more who continue to live in silence. Mr. Speaker, today is not about you, it is not about I, and it's not about our colleagues. This is not a conservative issue, it is not a Liberal or NDP issue. Today is about the brave men and women who serve our communities and our country without hesitation, without fail. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to read an email that I received about 2 weeks ago. Our paramedics and our other first responders in Canada are amazing. We demand they show up for anything at any house, at any time, in any weather. They fix our injuries. They treat our sicknesses. They restart our hearts. Then they wash their hands, head for home, and then they rise again to answer the call of duty. They do this job without thanks because they want to heal and they want to ease the pain. They do this job without fanfare or pursuit of fame and then feel like they get tossed to the curb when the stress builds up too much. Our first responders across Canada need to be treated like the heroes and humans they are. This bill needs to pass. There is no rescue for the rescuers, Mr. Speaker. This is just one email, one story, but there are tens of thousands more like it across our country. After being elected on October 19th of 2015, 1 week later I arrived in Ottawa as a newly elected MP for the riding of Caribou Prince George. I had with me 2 documents and a head filled with big ideas. The first document was an analysis of the challenges and opportunities that existed in my riding. And the second was the background for Bill C-211. Over the course of the 2 years I spent campaigning both to win the Conservative nomination and the general election, I met with people from all walks of life. I heard deeply personal, intimate, and stories of hardship and pain. Many of these individuals themselves were struggling with PTSD, or they knew a colleague, a friend, or had a family member who has contemplated suicide or indeed had taken their life. They experienced the pain and suffering that is a result of post-traumatic stress disorder. Mr. Speaker, Bill C-211 was born out of these stories. Because it was through these stories that I realized that there is no standard of diagnosis, of care, of treatment, or even terminology for PTSD that is consistent from one end of our nation to another. The outpouring of letters and phone calls that my office has received since the bill was first introduced last year has been overwhelming. The stories are overwhelming. I've worked hard to meet with individuals and organizations across the country who are only asking for proper care to be made accessible for those who are frontline warriors, those who have dealt with the sights, sounds, and smells that average Canadians would find horrifying and heartbreaking. Mr. Speaker, our brave men and women, they put their uniforms on every day, knowing full well that they may have to take the life of another person during the course of their service to our community and our country, or that in their service, in their dedication to our community and country, they may indeed make the ultimate sacrifice themselves. Bill C-211 seeks to establish a cohesive and coherent national framework to ensure our military, first responders, paramedics, police personnel, firefighters, emergency dispatch, veterans, and correctional officers get timely access to the resources they need to deal with PTSD. This bill sends a message to our silent sentinels that this is not a battle you have to fight yourself, that someone is fighting for them. It is up to all of us, federal, provincial, and territorial legislators, to come up with a plan to ensure that no one is left behind, that our terminology and laws are consistent across this country, from the East Coast to the West Coast, so that an RCMP member serving in Nova Scotia has consistent care with his or her colleagues across our nation, so that a firefighter that is not well has the courage to come forward and say, I am not well. That our veterans or our current military know that just as they stood tall for your family and mine, that someone is fighting for them. That they know that they are not alone. That they can get the care and attention they need when they need it, wherever they need it. Bill C-211 is about being human, Mr. Speaker. It is about taking a stand. It is not about assigning blame, not passing the buck, not turning a blind eye and say it's not my problem. Bill C-211 is about breaking the stigma of mental health injuries, about helping build the courage to come forward and tell their story, to seek help. Mr. Speaker, I've been told over the course of the last year that PTSD is a provincial matter, that this is an issue for the industry to solve. I've also been told that people should know what they're getting themselves into when they sign up for the job contracts, when they go into service. Mr. Speaker, I want to reiterate that it is up to all of us to come up with solutions, because lives are being lost. We are inundated with media or stories of another veteran, another first responder that has taken their lives, that has lost the fight due to PTSD. This is unacceptable, Mr. Speaker. Since I tabled my bill over a year ago, countless lives have been lost. This is shameful. We must do better. And this begins with education and a willingness to listen without judgment. Because less known to the general public are the mental demands that these occupations face. This includes working in a profession that regularly exposes you to graphic scenes and images that anyone would find disturbing and difficult to see. Mr. Speaker, my bill focuses on first responders, veterans, and militaries. And indeed, even in these three groups, we had differing terms, references, and sector inclusion. Recently, I had the opportunity to speak with a gentleman by the name of Mark Ferrant, who shared with me that jurors who, in accepting their civic duty, swear an oath to the Crown. In fulfilling their duty to the Crown, they're subjected to the horrific crimes committed. They bear witness to graphic details and images over the course of their duty, whether it's 9 days or 9 months or 19 months. Then just as they're sworn to secrecy, they are turned out in anonymity to somehow reconnect in our communities, void of the experience and human tragedy that they have witnessed, tossed aside, if you will. Well, not part of this legislation. It is my hope that bringing this forward tonight and speaking to it, that the Minister of Justice perhaps can review this issue, and that part of our national discussion regarding mental health, we can have this. We can talk about those that are impacted by this. Mr. Speaker, the reality is that experiencing human tragedy affects us all differently. One story is not the same. Just as one story is not the same, there is not a one-size-fits-all treatment. These incidences and experiences cannot be erased from our memory. One cannot just hit reset. Instead, the images, sights, and sounds, smells keep playing on a continual loop. Simple things can trigger anxiety attacks or severe depression. Mr. Speaker, Staff Sergeant Kent McNeil of the Prince George RCMP told me recently, for over 16 years, I've served as an RCMP in my community. Over 8 of these years, I led serious crime investigations just in my daily commute. I passed by 2 sites of horrific crimes. A simple action of dropping my daughter off at school triggers my PTSD. Mr. Speaker, triggers can come at any time and any place without warning. A noise, a sight, a sound, or a smell can trigger the debilitating effects of PTSD. Most of us can never imagine what our warriors go through on a daily basis. And I know there are practical questions that members across the way may be asking themselves. Will there be a cost for implementing a national framework for PTSD? The simple answer is yes, it will cost money. But I counter with this. What is the alternative? What is the cost of inaction? How many more lives are we willing to lose before the government? Before we step up to the plate. If members on all sides choose to vote down Bill C-211, what then are we proposing as a substitute? What is the message we are sending to those who we trust to be there when we are in need? Those who without hesitation answer when the world calls. The question we need to ask ourselves today, what value do we place on these brave men and women? Because right now, we have a piecemeal system of scattered provincial legislation. Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick have all taken steps to rightfully adopt legislation to deal with PTSD. And while we are making progress on this front, and we have come a long ways in recognizing PTSD, leadership is needed at our level, at the federal level. The standard of care varies from one province to the next. And we have people falling through the cracks, Mr. Speaker. Individuals suffering from PTSD have an 80% higher risk of suffering from depression, anxiety, alcoholism, drug abuse, and suicidal thoughts. As a society and as legislator, we have failed to come up with solutions to help our heroes, our warriors, the families, and the survivors, because a hero in the East, Mr. Speaker, should be treated the same as a hero in the West. Let's get this bill to committee so that we can discuss and amend it if necessary. But even with this, Mr. Speaker, we have studied this enough to recognize that much more needs to be done and action is required. Last October, the Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security tabled the report, Healthy Minds, Safe Communities, supporting our public safety officers through a national strategy for operational stress injuries. Bill C-211 was tabled before this committee, and I had the opportunity to participate in that study also. The report echoes much of what I'm saying today. And indeed, the minister's own response to the committee report was saying the government acknowledges the needs articulated by Canada's public safety officers and agrees that in recognition of the daily challenges that are unique to public safety officers in the community, national leadership and alignment are necessary in order to effectively address this multidisciplinary issue. Mr. Speaker, I think Bill C-211 is a perfect place to start and is in line with the government's own commitments. Therefore, it's my hope that we can move swiftly because, Mr. Speaker, we will save lives. And I can tell you this, every minute wasted, every hour wasted, every day wasted, we are losing lives. Action is needed. We are at a crisis level. As I near now what I know is a very long speech, I'd like to acknowledge that I am the first one to admit when I stand up in this House, it's usually to act as a voice of opposition to the issue of the day. But Bill C-211 transcends party lines and partisan squabbles. It is an opportunity for all parliamentarians to stand together and acknowledge the very real impact that PTSD has had on lives of our warriors. And if you would bear with me, I get up, I just want to read an excerpt from another website. I get up at all hours of the night. I check the house over and over. I don't even know what I'm looking for. I was asleep about a month ago, and I just knew that someone had fired a gun in my living room. I hear people pound on my door in the middle of the night when, in fact, I know that no one was ever there. One night I got up out of bed. I don't even know what I was looking for, but on the way through the house, I cocked my weapon and the .357 discharged and shot a hole through my floor. I need help. I've been dealing with this for 2 years and too long. I need help. Mr. Speaker, By nature, our first responders are part of a culture that frowns upon weakness. Job first, feelings, wellness, and family come second. When lives are affected by PTSD, families are left behind to pick up the pieces on their own. Families are forgotten. Only through bipartisan support and cooperation can we hope to achieve effective and viable strategies, terminology, education to help deal with PTSD. Through Bill C-211, we have the opportunity to recognize the sacrifice that our brave men and women have made so we can be here today. Our warriors are our silent sentinels, protecting our Canadian values and our way of life. They ensure our Maple Leaf stands tall, that Canada remains the true north, strong and free. As parliamentarians, let's stand in solidarity, support for those who are willing to give their lives to protect ours. I'm asking for your assistance today so that we can begin to work on a national framework, and I ask that all members in this House help in achieving this goal by voting for Bill C-211 at second reading, because, Mr. Speaker, and to my honourable colleagues, lives are at stake. Thank you.
Questions and comments? The honourable member. Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And, you know, I think it's really important that we do recognize that this is a very serious issue. I appreciate the many words the member has put on the record in introducing the bill. You know, whether it's our members of our Canadian Forces, our first responders, police, many public safety officers, there are so many horrific acts that do occur, Mr. Speaker, where it has a significant impact on the individual in question. And there is no doubt that as a government we need to do more. We can always do better, as the Prime Minister has said. It's one of the reasons, even when I was in opposition, I talked so passionately about the importance of a health care accord. That's one of the reasons why I think it's so important that we recognize that how many hundreds of millions of dollars we are committing now going into the mental health services, that we need to start to take action where we can. I appreciate what the member is bringing forward for us today, and maybe just ask him to emphasize, and my question would be to emphasize how important it is that there is a holistic approach that does include multiple departments, different levels of government, and so forth. And I think that's quite admirable, and we'll have to wait.
The honourable member for Caribou Prince George.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I appreciate our honourable colleagues' comments. I can't help but take perhaps wrongly or falsely a dismissive tone or hear a dismissive tone. I absolutely agree that a holistic approach needs to be taken, that there are all departments that need to be included in this. It's why that we called on the Minister of Public Safety and Health, the Minister of Veterans Affairs, and the Minister of National Defence to get together with our provincial legislators and territorial legislators, as well as academics, as well as the military, as well as the industry, to have that holistic approach, to really take a look at what we're seeing. Because right now, Mr. Speaker, I can tell you that people are hurting and people are struggling because there isn't consistent care, there isn't consistent treatment, there isn't consistent diagnosis. And if we fail today, I shudder to think of where we're going to be.
Question et commentaire. L'honorable député de Beloeil-Chambly.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je veux remercier mon collègue pour son travail dans ce dossier. Je veux aussi remercier un de mes commettants, un citoyen de Chambly, Patrick Dufresne, qui est avec les paramédics du Québec, qui est ici à Ottawa aujourd'hui pour se joindre au travail de mon collègue pour ce projet de loi. C'est lui d'ailleurs qui m'a initialement mis la puce à l'oreille de l'importance de travailler ce dossier. Et en plus, comme porte-parole du NPD en matière de sécurité publique, j'ai pu participer au travail de ce comité, justement, auquel mon collègue a pu assister à quelques rencontres, qui a sorti un rapport unanime sur le besoin d'agir dans ce dossier. C'est peut-être plus un commentaire qu'une question, alors je laisserai peut-être mon collègue commenter davantage ce qui a besoin d'être fait, mais je veux surtout le remercier pour son travail et de dire qu'il y a encore beaucoup de travail à faire dans un dossier comme celui-là.
The honourable member for Caribou Prince George.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank our honourable colleague. There are colleagues from all sides of the House that are passionate on this and that worked in the committee. Mr. Speaker, you know, the term first responder, the term public safety officer, the term PTSD, OSI, Standard care and diagnosis needs to be done, and that report that was done by the Public Safety and Security Committee was a great report, because it identified exactly what we're talking about today, that there needs to be work done. We need to get people together. There is. I agree with our honourable colleague. There is much work to be done, but it has to start somewhere, and today's the day.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Oshawa.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to sincerely thank my colleague from Caribou Prince George for all the work that he has done on this file and his leadership. He's a very modest man, but to get this to where it is today, I know that he has garnered the support from all over the country, and I do know that he wants to take a moment just to thank some of the other people that really did help make this day come forth, and I'd like to give him that opportunity right now.
The member for Caribou Prince George.
Mr. Speaker, first and foremost, I want to thank the Public Safety Committee for tabling such a great report that specifically detailed the need for this. I also want to thank Paul and Terry Nichols for Community for Veterans, our local firefighters, 1372 in Prince George, Badge of Life, Gary Ruby, Sid Gravel, Bill and Lynn Russ, Natalie Harris, Jody Middick, Vince Savoya, Tima, Memorial Contra, Dr. Katie Camcart, Aaron Alvarez, our own Aaron O'Toole, John Broussard, Dr. Colin Carey, Kent McNeil, and Norm Oglard. Mr. Speaker, many of those names you don't know, but they came forward to tell their story. They came forward to try and save a life, not just their own, but they came forward with those. And Mr. Speaker, I want to acknowledge that there are many people here today that have, on the Hill, that have shared their story with me, with the hopes that not just ending their own struggle, but ensuring that those coming behind this, that they don't have to struggle, that we can do everything in our power to put those pieces in place to make sure that we don't lose another life.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Guelph.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I first want to thank the member from Caribou Prince George for bringing this very important issue before the House, an issue that's silently affecting many Canadians every day. Post-traumatic stress disorder is a matter close to the hearts of many, even in this House, as the member has said. Some members have honorably served on the front lines of emergencies. Some have families and loved ones whose lives have been touched by those working tirelessly to protect us. In fact, Mr. Speaker, my grandfather immigrated from England, serving the Royal Engineers in World War I, and spent many months in the Brandon Sanatorium being treated during a time when there was very little known about these disorders. The government stands proudly behind our country's police officers, paramedics, and firefighters. We stand behind Indigenous emergency managers, correctional officers, 911 dispatchers, and border guards. We stand, of course, behind the members of our armed forces. And we stand behind all the brave women and men who have pursued the noble path of public service and who put their safety and well-being at risk for the sake of their communities and of their country. In our platform, we committed to developing a national action plan on post-traumatic stress disorder, and the Prime Minister's mandate letter to the Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness instructs him to work with the provinces and territories and the Minister of Health to develop a coordinated action plan on post-traumatic stress disorder, which disproportionately affects public safety officers. Indeed, the research shows that between 10 and 35% of first responders will develop post-traumatic stress injuries in their lifetime. An estimated 70,000 Canadian first responders have already been diagnosed. That's why I'm proud to say that our government is hard at work developing the action plan to address post-traumatic stress disorder among public safety officers that we promised during our campaign. Immediately after our government took office, Public Safety Canada launched an extensive consultation process, beginning with sessions in Ottawa and Regina, to hear from stakeholders about PTSD and other operational stress injuries, and about what kinds of supports they needed. As part of these consultations, we heard directly from public safety officers as well as from healthcare practitioners and all levels of government. We heard about barriers people face when seeking assistance. We heard about cases of limited access to treatment options, the challenges of geographic isolation, and a general lack of awareness regarding operational stress injuries and PTSD, including a lack of awareness about the symptoms and about available supports. And we agree that the many voices have told us that much more needs to be done. In particular, we heard about the need to address three key themes: research and data collection, prevention, early intervention, and stigma reduction, and the support for care and treatment. And the stakeholders, the stakeholders' voices have recently been bolstered by a report on the Standing Committee, as was mentioned, the Committee on Public Safety and National Security. Mr. Speaker, that committee also heard from a wide range of organizations and individuals, including the Canadian Police Association, Mood Disorders Society of Canada, and many experts on psychiatry and mental health. At this point, I want to mention that Mood Disorders Canada is in my riding of Guelph. In fact, Phil Upshall, the Society's executive director, has made it clear to me that our nation needs to do more to assist those who suffer from this condition, especially when so many are affected by it and as a result of their nation's service and our first responders. Another unique Guelph organization that's leading the nation in treating PTSD is the Homewood Health Centre. Homewood has developed the program for traumatic stress recovery, one of the few inpatient programs of its kind in Canada. The program for traumatic stress recovery helps patients recover from the after effects of trauma and creates a community that helps trauma patients through the healing process. Mr. Speaker, I think we have to look at those Canadians that have helped us in so many ways to provide safety for our communities, and in process of so doing have stood in the way of danger themselves. The committee has also received briefs on the Badge of Life of Canada, the Royal Ottawa Health Centre Group, and the Union of Canadian Correctional Officers, among many others. Their final report affirms that the well-being of those who serve our communities is absolutely vital to the safety of all Canadians. And the report makes 16 recommendations. As the Minister of Public Safety wrote in the government's response, the committee's report presents important considerations to inform the government's approach to supporting those who have dedicated their lives to protecting our communities. The report will be a valuable resource as the government moves forward with its commitment to supporting the well-being and resilience of Canada's public safety officers. Mr. Speaker, through all this momentum and action, a clear consensus has emerged. National leadership and coordination are needed to address this issue effectively. Resilience and reintegration and the need for coordinated national research have all been identified as important themes. And there remains a broad view that a national plan must recognize that effective support demands coordinated national baseline research. An action plan must recognize the importance of collaboration in providing access to prevention, education, and training measures, as well as to innovative care and effective treatment. And finally, we've heard loud and clear that we must promote awareness for public safety officers and their families of both the symptoms to watch for and the treatment resources that are available to them. Mr. Speaker, strengthened by all of these voices over the last year, we're moving this action plan forward, helping to bring post-traumatic stress disorder and operational stress injuries out of the shadows and into the light. I'm pleased that our discussions in this chamber make that light even brighter. Indeed, over the course of the last year, members have had more opportunity than ever before to bring this issue to the forefront. We're making sure that we're talking to the right people, moving forward in a way that reflects the voices that we've heard, and working closely with all partners as this plan develops. We've reflected this priority every way we can, including through the budget process, with Budget 2016 reflecting the government's commitment to an action plan. But this goes beyond commitment, Mr. Speaker. It's a responsibility of the government and of all of us who represent our communities that rely on the tireless and selfless contributions of the brave women and men who keep us safe. And to those men and women, we say thank you. And thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Victoria.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very, very pleased to rise in support of Bill C-211 and thank the member for Caribou Prince George for bringing this bill forward, and thank my colleague from Guelph for his thoughtful remarks as well. This bill, of course, would create a federal framework for post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. That is a mental condition that can devastate an individual, impacting their family, their ability to work, and even their ability to perform simple tasks. As is the case with other mental health conditions, public awareness is often grown in the wake of extreme events such as wars or disasters. But sadly, it's been our experience in Canada as we see men and women returning from Afghanistan and struggling for years with the burdens of their experience there, to think that this is simply limited to those kind of extreme events. A soldier returning from a distant combat zone may be the first image in our minds when we talk about PTSD, but more and more we are learning that stress, trauma, and our body's complex responses to it are issues throughout society, far from battlefields or police precincts or emergency wards. We see it, Mr. Speaker, on university campuses, where students are helping expand access to mental health services and offer more support for survivors of abuse, including sexual abuse. And we see it in workplaces, where employers and workers are finding ways to reduce the stigma of mental illness and to encourage those who once suffered in silence to find the help that they need. Nearly a decade ago, one academic study pegged the lifetime incidence of post-traumatic stress disorder across the Canadian population at nearly 1 in 10. In most cases, this could be linked to a single event, such as the unexpected death of a loved one, sexual assault, or witnessing a violent death or injury. But while any Canadian can experience PTSD, certain Canadians are disproportionately likely to shoulder the burden. In particular, Mr. Speaker, I'm referring to frontline workers who volunteer for duties that expose them to extraordinary stress. They're police officers and firefighters. They're paramedics and prison guards. They're military personnel and others whose public service can take a great personal toll. Studies have found that members of these professions can experience PTSD at rates at least double that of the general population. A number of provinces have moved forward on legislation to remove the barriers that Canadians in these professions may face. For instance, in my province of British Columbia, first responders who experience PTSD must prove that it is work-related in order to receive support and compensation. Last year in my home province, the NDP Labour critic tried to amend a bill in the provincial legislature to fix that problem and make it easier for those first responders, police, firefighters and others, to get the help they need and deserve. It is absolutely shameful that the current government of British Columbia declined to fix that problem. Let me share just one story to illustrate why this is so important. Lisa Jennings. She was a paramedic in Victoria. In the summer of 2014, Lisa suffered an assault while responding to a call. In the wake of the attack, she suffered flashbacks and suicidal thoughts. After consulting with a psychologist, she filed a claim for workers' compensation. Her claim was denied, not once, not twice, but 3 times, because the board was able to argue that her condition was not the result of the trauma that she'd experienced in that assault. In fact, because she visited a psychologist after her parents and her brothers quickly died in quick succession, she was labeled as having a, quote, well-documented psychiatric history, and her claim was denied. Shameful. But Lisa fought back. With no financial support other than a small disability pension, she appealed the ruling. She even lived in her car while doing so. But as Lisa said, this is for all the first responders in BC. I'm happy to report, Mr. Speaker, that 3 weeks ago, Lisa Jennings won her battle. An appeal tribunal reversed the earlier decisions, clearing a path for other first responders to access the support they need after suffering trauma in the line of duty. A story like that should shock all Canadians and should move us in this place to act. Luckily, we have before us a proposal that would take one step forward, providing the much-needed federal leadership in this context. So what would the bill do? It would instruct the Minister of Health to convene a conference with her colleagues in National Defence and Veterans Affairs, provincial and territorial governments, and stakeholders in the medical community to develop a comprehensive federal strategy framework on post-traumatic stress disorder. This framework would help illuminate the prevalence of PTSD across Canada, as well as its social and economic costs to Canadians, by facilitating better national tracking and data collection by Public Health Agency of Canada. It would also seek to improve treatment by making it easier to share best practices and by establishing guidelines for diagnosis, treatment, and management of PTSD. Lastly, it would broaden awareness of this condition by setting down guidelines for the creation and distribution of educational materials for public health providers across this country. I want to raise one final issue, Mr. Speaker. Several months ago, I was contacted by Mark Ferrant, a Toronto man who served as a jury foreman on a first-degree murder trial. In the course of that trial, he and other jurors were exposed to graphic and disturbing visual evidence and testimony surrounding the brutal murder of a young woman. Jurors are sworn to secrecy and, the moment after the verdict is delivered, released back into their daily lives. In the wake of that experience, though, Mark began to experience symptoms that would later be diagnosed as PTSD. It would come to disrupt his personal life, his young family, and his successful business career. And yet, as Mark discovered, jurors in Canada are uniquely unsupported by our justice system. There's supports for judges, court staff, and many others that are exposed to the same graphic evidence and stressful situation, but not for ordinary Canadians who are required to do their civic duty as jurors. I think it's time that changed. I think every Canadian, no matter where they live, who does their civic duty and serves on a jury ought to have the proper support services available. So to that end, I raised this issue with my colleagues on the Justice Committee last year and have written repeatedly to the Minister of Justice asking that her department assess what steps it can to address this gap. It's my hope that the Justice Committee will soon become the first parliamentary committee to study this problem during its upcoming review of the Criminal Code. While sadly we are still waiting for any federal response, I'm happy to report that as a result of Mark Ferrant's tireless advocacy and at great personal cost, his home province of Ontario just weeks ago launched a program to provide free counselling to jurors who need it. So if this bill is referred to committee, I will be seeking to develop an amendment to ensure that the issue of juror support is considered in any federal framework on PTSD. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, the bill before us today gives us a chance to stand beside Canadians like Mark Ferrant in Toronto and Lisa Jennings in Victoria, who've swam against the tide of personal costs to do us all a public service. And in that spirit, I ask all members to support this bill. Thank you.
The honourable member for resuming debate, the honourable member for Barrie Innisfil.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my honourable colleague from Victoria for stating his unequivocal support for this private member's bill, and for my colleague from Guelph who did a speech, although we've yet to hear whether in fact his party, the government, will be supporting this legislation. Mr. Speaker, first responders, firefighters, military personnel, corrections officers, police officers, frontline healthcare workers, like our dedicated nurses and countless others, face traumatic situations in their day-to-day work. The work they do to serve their fellow citizens and to protect our great country. And while the work that these men and women do is well known, what is less known is the mental demands that these occupations require. In these professions, men and women are regularly exposed to graphic scenes and images that anyone would find difficult and sometimes even heartbreaking to see, this making them exceedingly susceptible to PTSD. As the official opposition critic for Veterans Affairs and having spent over 3 decades as a firefighter, I'm all too familiar with the devastating effects of PTSD and how it plays on those who wear the uniform and the negative impacts on their families. PTSD is a condition that's characterized by persistent emotional distress occurring as a result of physical injury or severe psychological shock. It typically involves disturbances of sleep and constant vivid recall of the traumatic experience with dulled responses to others and to the outside world. Post-traumatic stress disorder is characterized by the onset of psychiatric symptoms after exposure to one or more of these traumatic events. The characteristics of PTSD develop in 4 domains: intrusion, avoidance, alterations in cognition and mood, alterations in arousal and reactivity. People can react in many different ways. They might feel nervous, have a hard time sleeping, or go over the details of the situation in their minds. Others have a more serious symptoms, and their lives can be seriously disrupted. Our society requires that these people continue to do their job, so it's the government's job to ensure that they have the ability to seek the help should they require it. Le projet de loi de C-211 permettrait aux hommes et aux femmes qui souffrent de la post-traumatique d'obtenir l'aide dont ils ont désespérément besoin. Nous devons aborder l'élaboration et la mise en œuvre d'un cadre fédéral sur la SSPT qui prévoit des pratiques exemplaires, la recherche, l'éducation et la sensibilisation de le traitement. Le besoin d'intervenants est élevé. Les personnels militaires, les anciens combattants et les policiers sont tenus de soutenir le SSPT en temps opportun. Le projet de loi demande qu'un cadre soit élaboré afin de relever les défis de la reconnaissance des symptômes et de fournir un diagnostic et un traitement opportun d'un syndrome de stress post-traumatique. Bill C-211 is a private member's bill sponsored by the member from Caribou, Prince George. I want to highlight and acknowledge all his hard work on this bill. Absolutely. Ever since we were elected to this Parliament, Mr. Speaker, I've had the pleasure and the honor of working with the member on this, and I know how extremely invested he is to ensure that our first responders and our military personnel and our frontline healthcare workers are looked after. These brave men and women do so much for our society and give back in ways that cannot be expressed in words. They give their lives to serve our country. C-211 would require the Minister of Health, the Minister of National Defence, and the Minister of Veterans Affairs to consult with the provinces and territories as well as stakeholders from the medical community and patients groups in order to develop a comprehensive federal framework to address the challenges of identifying the symptoms and providing a timely diagnosis for the treatment of these men and women who are suffering from PTSD. There are some statistics that I'd like to share in order to highlight the high PTSD rates among Canadian first responders. 24 to 26% of correction officers suffer from PTSD. 22 of 24% of paramedics suffer from PTSD. 16% of firefighters suffer from PTSD. 10 to 12% of police officers suffer from PTSD, and 5.3% of military personnel suffer from PTSD. And we cannot forget those who serve on the front lines of the medical field, including doctors and our hardworking nurses. These statistics clearly highlight that large percentages of workers in these essential professions are suffering, Mr. Speaker. I want to share with you the story of Natalie Harris, a paramedic from my riding, who was on the front line and the first on the scene of a brutal double homicide. Natalie, who's become a friend and an inspiration to me throughout this process of supporting the member from Cariboo, Prince George, experienced unimaginable traumatic events while working a shift as a Simcoe County paramedic. Rather than focus on the event and the effects it had on Natalie, I want to focus on her advocacy to help others who suffer from PTSD. Natalie began her road to recovery by simply telling her story. She told her story to a lot of people. In fact, it was at an event in Barrie that we first met. That night, I told Natalie that I would help her raise the awareness of the issue at a national level, and here we are, Mr. Speaker. Shortly after the election, the member from Cariboo, Prince George, and I talked about the work that he had done to that point and his plans to introduce this bill. For Natalie, the work continued in spite of some lapses and triggers. She continues and continued to speak out, continued to support others suffering from PTSD through social media and a support group she called Wings for Change. Recently, Natalie wrote a book to reach even more people with her story. What an inspiration, Mr. Speaker. What an inspiration. Mental health is important to talk about. Those who suffer from PTSD need better resources. To quote Bill Rusk of Badge of Life Canada, there's more of a chance of a police officer following through with a suicide because they have the means readily available to them, as opposed to a member of the public who might have the same feelings but not the means readily available. We have a problem here, and it needs government's attention. Mental illness like PTSD can strike at any time, to anyone regardless of your age, race, gender, occupation, or income level. It does not discriminate, and it is nonpartisan. Vince Savoy of TEMA shared some sad news from his research on PTSD. He shared that roughly 60% of first responders who committed suicide in 2015 were diagnosed with PTSD. These are great tragedies, Mr. Speaker. We need to give our servicemen and women the help they need and allow them to live their lives in the fullest rather than be burdened by their illness. People who are in these professions wake up every single day and know that when they go to work, their life is at risk to support our country and their fellow Canadians. They perform brave tasks day in and day out and are left with the haunting images, sounds, and smells for their lifetimes. Being witness to tragedies and suffering that they see often becomes difficult to cope with. Through the work of this bill, the meetings with stakeholders, and the development of this framework, it's my hope that the men and women who do so much for us are able to have the services they require and know that they are not alone in this fight. We owe it, Mr. Speaker, to these servicemen and women who serve us relentlessly day in and day out to address PTSD as it can severely impact their lives and the lives of their families. In larger context, mental illness indirectly affects all Canadians, whether through a family member, a friend, colleague, and 20% of Canadians will personally experience a mental illness in their lifetime. Our first responders, our veterans, our frontline medical personnel are sick, not weak, Mr. Speaker, and they need this country's help. So I ask all members in this House to support the bill that's brought forward from my friend and colleague, the member from Cariboo Prince George.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Central Nova.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the opportunity today to debate the creation of a federal framework on PTSD through Bill C-211. And I'd like to thank the honourable member for Cariboo Prince George for shining a light on this important issue and for his very thoughtful remarks today. It's hard to do justice to an issue of this magnitude in just a little less than 10 minutes, but certainly I'll do my best. Over the course of the next few minutes, I hope to highlight the importance of the issue of post-traumatic stress disorder nationally and in my own community, the impact that it has not just on members of our military, but on emergency service workers as well, as so many have alluded to, and the impact that this bill could potentially have in collaboration with some other initiatives that are going on in communities across Canada and indeed within the federal government today. Beginning first with the issue of post-traumatic stress disorder in our military. I have to commend anyone who's had the opportunity to serve. So many who do so knowing that they may not return safely or may not return at all. And far too many of those who do serve overseas that are lucky enough to come home do so with physical or emotional scars that run so deep they may never be cured. In my view, the cost of engaging our military in a mission that puts the lives of Canadians in danger includes the cost that it takes to make sure that they're well. If we can afford simply put, if we can afford to send our citizens to war, we can afford to take care of them when they come home, full stop. The Canadian forces are in a mental health crisis. The Afghanistan mission serves as a perfect example. Every member of this House well knows the turmoil that those who have served faces today. Since the end of the mission, at least 71 members of the Canadian forces have taken their own lives. By comparison, I believe the total who lost their lives in combat during the course of that mission is 138, every one a tragedy. But the fact that we're now over the 50% loss of lives in the mission through veterans who have taken their lives by suicide is a statistic that should shock the conscience of every Canadian, and we need to do something about this. And we have the capacity to do something about this. This is a difficult issue for the region that I represent because of some recent events that took place earlier in January in the community of Upper Big Trackety. Just minutes away from the town that I was born in, we had an infantryman take his own life. And when you hear his family speak about it, they speak about the inner demons that he faced and was unable to overcome. What made the tragedy that much worse, that it wasn't just his life that was taken, but the lives of his family as well. His mother, Brenda, was killed. His wife, Shanna, who recently graduated from St. Francis Xavier University, where I studied and worked in that hospital that I was born in, and his 10-year-old daughter, Aaliyah, were all killed as a result of this horrific incident. This bill may not have done something for that specific incident, and it may take a long time to make a difference. The initiatives we're trying to launch at the federal level may take a very long time to make a difference. But my father always told me the best day to plant a tree is today, so we may as well take the chance while we have it. It's not just our military, so many of others have mentioned, that are impacted by post-traumatic stress disorder. Our emergency service workers go through turmoil that I'm so lucky to not have witnessed myself, and that every member of this House who's not worked as an emergency service worker can probably not understand. I've been taking meetings with police officers, with firefighters, with paramedics who've explained unimaginable horrors to me that they live through in the course of an ordinary day. As other members alluded to, they hear the sounds that they've heard. They smell the smells that they've smelled. They relive the events time and time again. It keeps them up at night, and it interferes with their ability to enjoy life in their full capacity as a human being, and that isn't right. We need to offer them the services that they so desperately need to be full and to be well. Mr. Speaker, this issue is not without hope, although I may have painted a bit of a desperate picture. There are things that we can be doing. I commend the effort in Bill C-211 to bring together different ministries like the Minister of Health, the Minister of Veterans Affairs, the Minister of Defense, along with medical service providers and, importantly, patient organizations. Because we know the answer is not simply just putting money into a program, but making sure that any efforts and any investments are made wisely to see the outcomes that we need that are actually going to improve the quality of life for people living in our communities. When I look at initiatives that are going on with all parties, I look at the committee report of the Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security. I look at the, again, multi-party committee on Veterans Affairs, which is undertaking a study on mental health and the suicide crisis amongst veterans in Canada. And I think this is a very positive thing. I saw, within a week of being sworn in as the Minister of Defense, I saw an article in the Globe and Mail where the Minister of Defense instructed the highest-ranking members of the forces to make the suicide crisis a priority. I see investments with provincial governments, like my own in Nova Scotia, where we've had dollars earmarked for mental health. We can see that in Canadian communities, this is a priority as well. We see organizations like TEMA that are trying to draw attention to the issue of post-traumatic stress disorder, but also help individuals who are trying to, again, become well. Whatever we can do to help those who defend our interests overseas, who keep us safe in our communities, and who respond when we are in need of emergency services, I'd like to communicate to you that whatever I can do to ensure that you have the mental health care that you need to be full and to do your job so my family and I can sleep safely at night, I will do what I can. Thank you very much.
Resuming debate. Reprise de débat. The Honourable Member for Oshawa.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I know I only have a short period of time to express something that, for me, I think this is a very proud day for me. I think it's a very proud day for this House. I've sat here and I've listened to speeches from across the aisles from each and every party. And I want to thank my colleague from Caribou Prince George, but also all the members of the House that participated in this debate. Because I think tonight we've done something very special. We've talked about this in a way that anybody watching tonight realizes that this is a nonpartisan issue. This is something that I think back when I was first elected to this House in 2004, we didn't know a lot about it. I don't think I ever heard of post-traumatic stress disorder. And I look about the effect that this is having in our communities. The people that we ask every single day to go out and protect our families, our communities. And Mr. Speaker, we do hourly, over and over and over and over and over again. This is a piece of legislation that is needed. I know my colleague said, you know, in Canada we can do better. But I think tonight we realize that we will do better. After listening to the comments around this House, as I said, I've been here since 2004, and I'm very proud of the system we do have in this country, but sometimes you don't get that opportunity to express your thanks, to be very proud of the people that sit in this House from across the aisle, colleagues that come here that do want to make a difference. And I think tonight, Mr. Speaker, we are going to be making a difference with this legislation that is thoroughly needed. Thank you very much.
The honourable member for Oshawa will have 8 minutes remaining for his remarks when the House next returns to debate on the question. The time provided for the consideration of private members' business has now expired, and the order is dropped to the bottom of the order of precedence on the order paper.